Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, it is my great honor to have as my guest, Mark Matousek. Mark is an award-winning author, teacher, and speaker. His books include two memoirs, Sex, Death, Enlightenment, A True Story, and The Boy He Left Behind, A Man's Search for His Lost Father. He is also the author of When You're Falling, Dive, Lessons in the Art of Living, Ethical Wisdom, The Search for a Moral Life, Ethical Wisdom for Friends, Mother of the Unseen World, The Mystery of Mother Meera, and Writing to Awaken, A Journey of Truth, Transformation, and Self-Discovery. Mark is also the founder of the Seekers Forum, a global online community for non-sectarian spiritual dialogue. As a teacher and speaker, Mark's work focuses on transformative writing for personal, professional, and spiritual development. His workshops, classes, and mentoring have inspired thousands of people around the world to reach their artistic and personal goals. Mark Matousek, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Thank you, Eric. It's really good to be here.
It's great to have you here. You've arrived. You are now the person you want to be.
I knew it would happen one day.
Right? I love introducing people that way. So typically the way I like to start these interviews is by asking guests to paint a picture of their childhood, the kind of environment that they were raised in, as a context for answering the question of what was your earliest notion that you can recall of who it was or what it was you wanted to be in the world, who you felt you were, what you sensed you wanted to do.
That's a great question. I grew up in a house where there was a lot of trauma and difficulty, pain, loss, violence, addiction, etc. And so I grew up feeling confined, confused, and also thrown upon my own resources. That's why I started writing when I was just a kid, to figure out who I was, what was going on, what was I thinking, what were these people around me, doing. I wrote as a way of, seeking truth for myself. So what I realized was that I wanted to be somebody who wasn't unhappy. I wanted to be somebody who wasn't depressed and addicted and confined by the story of their own lives. The people in my family seemed to be living inside a very rigid sense of who they could be. And I wanted to be someone with a sense of possibility. That was my deepest sense. And I also knew that there was something inside me, like a germ or a seed, that had something unique to say. And that I was original in who I was, even though I didn't know what that would turn into, but I felt like it was bigger than my environment. So I grew up feel that the claustrophobia I felt as a kid actually served me, because it turned me into a seeker. It turned me into somebody who was determined to make my own way, because I was born on the wrong side of the tracks. I didn't have a silver spoon. Didn't have a lot of those kinds of advantages. So I had to be self-motivated, which at the time, of course, one wishes that weren't true, but in retrospect, it served me very, very well. I know, for example, lots of folks now who grew up very well-to-do and entitled, who are kind of lost. Of course, to be rich, financially wealthy is a blessing in certain ways, but if you've had that from the beginning, I think it disables other things in you, and it can create a weird kind of self-doubt and lack of self-trust. So where I came from, that wasn't happening. I needed to do it for myself, and that does give you a different kind of a confidence.
Yeah, that's a fascinating answer. I agree with you. I do think that, it's a fine line, right? Because we wouldn't wish childhoods like the one you had on anyone. In the second chapter of your first memoir, Sex, Death, Enlightenment, you describe in pretty vivid detail some of the gut-wrenching experiences you had as a very young boy growing up in in the midst of serious dysfunction. One trauma after another, kind of like, just sort of repeated experiences of grief, kind of like in succession. And it's a very, very compelling and heartbreaking thing to read. But it is really interesting to hear your insights about how you eventually turned these into assets. And also the flip side of that, which is that when all of our needs are met as a youngster, and when we have not really suffered any difficulties, that in itself, I love the word you use, could be disabling in its own right. So the message I kind of take from your answer is, regardless of the upbringing we've had, life is going to be challenging in one way or another.
That's absolutely right. I'm not saying you have to have a miserable childhood to develop confidence or to have ambition. But we all do confront our own unique set of challenges. And the difference between a seeker and somebody who isn't a seeker is a seeker says, I'm not satisfied with being unhappy and staying stuck in the conditions of my life. I'm going to find a way of evolving and transforming beyond my limitations. The other kind of person, and I'm oversimplifying obviously, but the other kind of person sort of says, okay, this is my lot in life. I accept this. And they lead lives of what Thoreau called, quiet desperation. And I didn't want to be desperate. There was a lot of desperation around me. And I knew I would get glimpses of people happy in the world. And I'd say, oh, she seems to have her act together. Oh, she doesn't seem to be depressed every day. Oh, she can make a plan 3 months ahead and actually follow through with it. Those kinds of small things when you grow up in the midst of a lot of dysfunction, when you realize, oh, there is a kind of order in the world. And if you tap into it inwardly and externally, your life can change. But it really means paying attention. It means knowing who you are. And it means excavating those parts of yourself that are unconscious.
Right. What also struck me about your answer to that question was it seemed like you had a sense from a really young age that things didn't have to be the way they were around you. And that's kind of surprising in a sense, because a lot of us assume that our reality, especially when we're young, is the reality. Like, this is everyone's experience, isn't it? But obviously you got glimpses of people who had, different home lives, and even, just as you said, different experiences of not being so deeply unhappy all the time.
Yes.
And so it made you curious. You also seemed to recognize that, some of the people around you had very rigid sense of who they were and what was possible for them. So, this sort of probing, maybe it was a function of your environment, but I imagine that there are a lot of people out there that have also had, come from dysfunctional families and homes who perhaps never had that insight or never had that epiphany that, wait, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. They may be equally driven about wanting to escape their own unhappiness, but it might not occur to them to kind of, think about other possibilities, let alone write about them. So I'm really intrigued by that. How old were you when you first started writing down your thoughts and trying to make sense of your life and the world?
I was in the second grade. So I was about 7 years old. And I can remember sitting, in the living room. I had this area in the living room. I lived in a crowded apartment with a lot of different people, but I found an area in the living room was just mine. It was about 4 by 4 square feet. And I would just sit there kind of Indian style with paper, any kind of paper. And I would just write and I would describe, and I was very lonely as a kid. So I became my own friend, I think.
Yeah.
And also my own witness, because when you grow up in a family with a lot of dysfunction, you don't have a sense of there being a reliable narrator. There's no consistent reality. So I was creating a consistency of reality for myself as a kid, and kind of inventing myself in a weird kind of way. And so for me, I've been doing that ever since I was a very small boy. That turned into journaling, and that turned into writing proper.
That's fascinating. I'm remembering a very short story that I read in elementary school. And if my memory serves, it was called Evan's Corner. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but
it's ringing a distant bell.
And again, I'm going to have to revisit this because my memory is going to be incomplete about this, but the story really appealed to me because the character in the story was this young boy who did exactly what you described. He had this little corner, this little space that he claimed as his own, and it was his refuge. And it was a safe place where he could imagine and just be free and be able to explore. And again, the details are I don't remember any details other than just that idea striking me as so incredibly appealing, even as a youngster. So, you talked about how, you started doing this writing kind of like intuitively, just to process and to befriend yourself and to give yourself some grounding in what was a very unsettling and inconsistent atmosphere. And you said that from there it progressed into, more, let's say, formal writing proper. I'm curious about your evolution as a writer, and at what point you decided to make this a professional endeavor.
I realized about halfway through my undergraduate studies that I was in the wrong place. I had declared a major at UC Berkeley in theater arts because I knew a lot of people in the entertainment business, and I thought, well, maybe I can make a career there. And so I majored in theater arts, and it really wasn't for me. I realized I'd much rather go to a play than create a play or act in a play. And I've always loved to write. And in college, I had two professors in particular who encouraged me to enter essays of mine into competitions. And I won both of those competitions. And that was really big for me. And then I got out of undergraduate, and then I said, I'm going to write to the LA Times and see if they will publish a book review by me. And if I tell you, Eric, I wrote to them easily 7 or 8 times, bugging. They finally sent me, a total nobody, undergrad, a book to review, which I did. And seeing my name in print for the first time was amazing. It was a revelation, and I got hooked, and I wanted to write that. Then that led to journalism, and then writing my first memoir in the mid-90s.
Do you happen to remember what that book was that you reviewed the first time you saw your name in print in the LA Times?
I don't remember. I do not remember the name of it. It was a book about theater, actually, which is, I think, why they gave it to me. And I was viciously mean. And I learned the lesson. And I will never do that again. It was all about showing off. It was a bad book, but it was really all about my showing off to show how well I could write.
Right.
And it took me not long, but I realized shortly thereafter, this is a real person who wrote this book. This is their baby. You have just massacred somebody's baby, in a review in brief in the LA Times, and I never did that again.
Wow. I'm reminded of the book by Don Miguel Ruiz, The Four Agreements, right? And the first agreement, you're nodding your head, so I'm guessing you're familiar with it. The first agreement is be impeccable with your word. And what he means several different things by that, right? So first he means kind of what it sounds like, say what you mean and mean what you say, right? In your communications, your life will go so much smoother if you do this. But he also talks about the power of your word and using it in a conscious and kind and loving way. Because it's very easy to use our words to strike people down and to, I mean, I think probably any writer at any point in his life has done this at some point. If only you have some personal agenda or issue you're trying to, and so you attack someone in writing. It was interesting that you were able to not just do that out of, not just like lash out, but it sounds like you fairly quickly realized, oh, this is actually hurtful.
I really hated how I felt afterwards. I had never done it before. I'm not defending myself, but the fact is that until I saw it in print, the penny didn't drop. That what I wrote on my little typewriter at the time, and then Xeroxed and sent in, was going to impact somebody's life. It was going to be out there before, thousands of readers, and not help his chances of getting his word out. So then the question arises: what do you do when something is bad?
Right.
Really unscary. And my solution to that is don't be a book reviewer.
I love it. I love it.
I decided I wouldn't be a book reviewer. Instead, I kind of turned toward doing interviews for a living, and I worked in the magazine business, got to talk to people about their stories, and that was much better. And kind of saved me, the karmic retribution of. It's hard not to tell your truth when they're paying you to have an opinion.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's a certain sensationalistic appeal to vicious reviewers, right? Like, and
do you remember John Simon?
No.
Oh, John Simon was a reviewer for everyone from New York Times to New York Magazine for years and years. And he wrote the most brilliant, most vicious, hilarious reviews. It was like a car wreck. You couldn't look away because he was so brilliant at eviscerating people and saying the most outrageous things in print. So it was a guilty pleasure to read John Simon. But I didn't want to be John Simon, but he was fun to read.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction. That was not the person you wanted to be, although you could appreciate what he did. It can be a guilty pleasure to consume that kind of thing, especially if it's really well done, right? Even if it's vicious, it feeds something in us. But I know that, like myself, you're a lifelong, more or less, fellow journaler, and a journal is a place where we can very safely say whatever we want, and we can be as vicious as we need to be, to kind of have the catharsis of it without needing to necessarily express it or have it read or seen or heard by other people. So that's just kind of a reminder too, that we can still do it, even and even amuse ourselves by doing it. Being conscious of the effect that it can have is important. And I love your solution to that. Don't be a book reviewer.
I'd like to just say a little bit about what you were just saying about being able to be vicious in a journal, for example.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of journaling and introspective writing, is it lets us have the entire spectrum of our experience without causing harm. And that is such a brilliant thing to be able to have, that you can actually say everything. You want to keep all of those, that muscle of truth telling about what's actually true for you, exercised and toned and really on point. You then can choose what you want to share with other people. But being able to have one place where you can be 100, aside from therapy for $200 an hour,
right?
One place where you can be 100% candid without any fear of retribution, I think is very therapeutic for the mind and for the soul.
Oh man, I love that you said that, and I so agree. I've had the experience of processing anger in my journal, and kind of letting out what I would like to say, or what my reaction is, right, in the journal, and then being able to, now having released that, being able to distance myself and say, okay, that's how I feel, and that's legitimate. Like, that is how I feel. Now, how do I want to respond in a way that is conscious, in a way that honors my feelings, but also, isn't going to be something I'm going to regret? I had this pause, and it was very satisfying because I got to have my reaction, and that felt good. And then I got to make a conscious choice about how I wanted to handle the situation. And I came up with a solution that was perfect. It did, it both honored my feelings and without having to be nasty. And so that's one of the many benefits of journaling.
And that's why it's a mindfulness practice.
Yeah. Right.
You're allowing all your thoughts and feelings to come up in consciousness and you put them down on paper. It doesn't mean you react to them.
Right. You don't want to suppress them, and you don't necessarily want to express them. So it's sort of like another yeah, you're right. It's way cheaper than therapy.
Way cheaper. And also you don't get into spiritual bypassing where you
Mm,
kind of, your mind says, oh, this is what I should say, going there, skipping all of your feelings and wondering, why you have acid reflux or why you
mm.
can't have intimate relationships, because you're never actually willing to be candid and take the risk of being open in the moment with your feelings. And so
And owning them, right?
and
Acknowledging them, like,
owning them, but you can do it in the privacy of your writing, rather instead of using other people as guinea pigs,
sure.
for
And if you're writing fiction, you can also include it. You can use it creatively, right? You can have a character act out the things that you never would dare, or say the things you never would dare. So that's another way you can kind of make use of it, I guess.
Fiction is the lie that tells the truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned how you pivoted into interviewing, and I know that you worked for several years at Andy Warhol's Interview magazine in New York. And the bio on your website states that you conducted hundreds of interviews with well-known figures in film, television, books, fine art, politics, design, and science. So being a novice at this, having started this podcast not too long ago, I have gained a greater appreciation for the art of interviewing. And there's so much to it. And anyone can be an armchair anything, right? And they can view it from a distance, say, oh, you should have asked this, or you missed this opportunity, or, and there are so many things there's so many things at play when you're interviewing another person, and it's a time limited. You're limited by the constraint of time. You maybe have some preparation you've done, hopefully, but you have to be alive and present to what comes up in the interview. So the subject of interviewing itself is fascinating to me. I wonder if, just off the top of your head, given the extensive amount of interviews you did, if there are any specific ones that really stick out in your memory as really like that left like a real impression. Now, this could be either the interview subject and the experience you had with that person, or it could be something they shared, anything at all. But are there any that just jump out at you when I ask that question?
A few do. I've interviewed a lot of great people in their fields. Luciano Pavarotti was amazing to
Wow.
interview. Maggie Smith was amazing to interview. Lawrence Durrell, the author, was amazing to interview. Annie Lennox was my most exciting interview to date because it was my first cover story when I was at interview, and I got to go to Paris and interview her in the recording studio, and it was amazing. So that was.
What year do you think that was?
About 1983.
So like at the pinnacle of the Eurythmics fame,
Yeah,
right?
the pinnacle of Eurythmics. They had just done 1984. In fact, they were in the studio recording the soundtrack to 1984, and one of the most embarrassing things in my life happened that day because I was interviewing Annie Lennox. It had all been set up. The magazine has flown me to Paris. It was 9 a.m. They had been up all night in the studio, and I was going to get to talk to them before they went home. So she's sitting there in dark glasses, and I'm sitting there, and I am nervous. And I've got my old tape recorder, the way we used to have with tapes in it. And we started having a really great conversation. And about 15 minutes into the conversation, I looked over and my tape recorder had stopped. And it's one of those moments you want to get in, go in, dig a hole and get in the ground. And she was very sweet about it. She said, "Oh, we can repeat anything. We can do something later if we need to," and it was fine. But I learned after that you always take 2 tape recorders when you do an interview.
So, wow, Annie Lennox. And were you a fan as well? And when you interviewed these huge names, how did being a fan of the person's work or not, impact the interview that you did, do you think?
I don't think it had a major impact because when I interview, at least maybe you have this experience, you're playing a role.
Right.
And I'm a very shy person, actually. I'm kind of an introverted person, but the minute I have an interview to do or I'm in that role, I could talk to anybody, and I never felt the slightest nerves.
Yeah.
Truly, it was odd. And then being myself, could I go to a cocktail party and just hang out? Absolutely not. But if I had a tape recorder,
You had a reason for being there. Yeah.
I
You
had
had
a
a
reason
role.
for being there, and I was protected with my shield of my tape recorder, and I was the one asking the questions. Then it didn't tended not to affect. On a personal level, absolutely, it would have, particularly writers. You know, when writers that I idolized, if I had to, in fact, I had the experience where somebody asked me to go out to lunch afterwards, and I said no, because I was just too nervous to be alone with them, even though we had just had this intimate conversation about their life.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah, we don't want to be disappointed by our heroes, I think is maybe one of the takeaways.
More than that, Eric, I didn't want to be seen as myself, for myself. I didn't want to just, I was in that, at that time of my life, we're talking 30 years ago, but I was extremely insecure. And I used my questions and my title as an editor or as the writer as a kind of mask to cover up a lot of my insecurities. And so there were two people. There was me when I wasn't doing it, me when and this isn't uncommon among writers. A lot of writers are extremely brave when they're alone in their with their typewriter or their computer. But
It's not even
get them in a room and they have a hard time having an actual, conversation.
It's not even uncommon among performers who you would expect would have all the confidence in the world, right? Like they're on stage.
I've seen that. Years ago, we went to see Lily Tomlin on Broadway, and afterwards I knew someone who knew her, and we went backstage, and she had been out there, for 2 hours on the stage, outrageous, hilarious, millions of characters. But as herself, Lily Tomlin in her dressing room, she had nothing to say. She was really, really shy, and it was almost like she was shrinking. And I've seen that a lot because of what I've done for a living. I've known a lot of well-known people and seen them in both, in public and in private, and the change is sometimes radical.
So I know that in the mid 80s, you left New York and you did a major life pivot. You kind of had, from the outside, a pretty great life. You had a successful career. You were in New York City, the happening place, et cetera, et cetera. What caused you to, what instigated this upheaval in your life? And you described the next decade or so as a quote unquote Dharma bum. So what happened? What precipitated this? And what was this chapter of your life like?
Well, the short answer is AIDS. My best friend from college died of AIDS in 3 months. We were on the beach one day, and I saw a little purple thing on the bottom of his foot, and 3 months later he was dead. And it completely turned my life upside down, because he was kind of a mirror for me. We had gone to Berkeley together, come to New York together. He was a successful lawyer. I was a successful editor, and we were just, it was all happening for us. And it was taken away from him just overnight. And that was my existential crisis. That made me realize that whether it was HIV/AIDS or something else, I was here for a very short period of time, and I'd really better ask myself, why wasn't I happier than I was? Because even though my life looked good from the outside, it wasn't good on the inside. Andy Warhol was a genius in many ways. He was also a slave driver as a boss. We would work 14, 15-hour days sometimes for a pittance. I had no social life. As I was saying earlier, I was very shy, so I kind of was isolating. I wasn't a happy guy. I just looked good from the outside because during the day I'd be hanging out with famous people.
Right.
But so that was it for me. I said, I can't do this. And as sometimes happens in life, I was lucky enough to meet the person I needed to meet in the moment when I most needed a change. And his name was Andrew Harvey, and he was a writer and a Oxford professor. And I had to have an interview him one day in my office at interview. And he walked in, he looked at me and he said, "You're having a spiritual crisis." And I said, "What?" He said, "I'm just telling you, darling," that's how he talked. "I'm telling you, darling, you're having a spiritual crisis." I said, "Why do you say that?" And he started telling me all the things he was picking up about the way I carried myself, things I said, and I knew he was totally right. And not long after that, I quit my job. I went with Andrew to India. He just happened to be going on a writing trip, and I went with him, and I never looked back. There was a before that moment and an after that moment. When when you look at the major shifts in the labyrinth of your life, that was a red flag moment for me. That was a real transition. And I thank God for it. It was a terrible time. It was horrible to watch friends dying and see live in terror for many, many years. But the truth is, it gave me my life. I realized who I was. I realized things from my childhood that had never made sense to me suddenly made sense. I realized I had always been asking myself these kinds of questions, but I thought it was just because I was kind of weird. And then I realized, oh, I'm a seeker. There's a whole lot of us out here. And that really changed everything. It changed what I wrote. I got out of the pop magazine business, and that's what led to me writing my first memoir and writing about psychology, consciousness, the things that I've been, covering for the last 30 years or so.
So it sounds like that was like an epiphany moment where you had been grappling with these things, and it was pointed out to you pretty directly by another person, and it struck a chord, right? And it sent you on a totally new path.
Also, because I was not a spiritual person, I had not had any religious upbringing at all. I was bar mitzvahed, but it was ridiculous. We did it for my grandfather. I never had any use for Judaism or for temple, and it just wasn't my path. And I was an agnostic. I was completely agnostic. So when to have it framed in that way,
right,
really shook me up, because I wasn't getting to the bottom of it psychologically. It was like there was more to it. There was something deeper. And I realized, I realized when Andrew said that there was really an existential quality to this. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is human life? Is there a God? Where are we going? Is there a purpose? Those were the things that had really shaken me up since I was a very young boy, but I didn't have language for it.
Wow. How do you define like terms like spiritual and spirituality? They're tossed around pretty frivolously. How do you define those?
Well, spirit comes from breath, and breath is all about opening. Spirituality is all about opening and connecting with the one and knowing ourselves as one with everything that exists. That's what spirituality is. And there are 1,000 different paths to getting there. But whatever unifies us with reality, with existence, is spiritual. And the thing that also reminds us that we are more than just our bodies, that there is more to us than just our biography. And I started to have experiences in meditation, also with certain teachers, that showed me very clearly the limitations of my mind and the limitations of my self-enclosed, mind-based sense of self. And that was exciting for me. That was another thing that was like an intuition. I can remember when I was a kid, when I'd sit in my little place and I'd write, I felt like there was a part of me that wasn't in just this little boy, that I would look in the mirror and say, I feel like there was something there that was beyond just my boy, but my little biographical physical self, but I didn't know what it was. That's the spiritual, and so we're all born with a sense of that, but we don't necessarily have language for it.
Yeah. Fascinating. And how also our intellect can get in the way of connecting with that, right? Our society tends to overemphasize the rational, the material, the intellectual, and often at the expense of felt experience and intuition, right? And even just curiosity about stuff that's beyond, that we can't see, about curiosity about the invisible.
Hugely. And that was a big question for me for many years. I would have these experiences, and then my mind would jump in there and want to tear them apart. Reason is a blunt object. Reason is looking for problems to solve. That's not what spiritual experience is about. Spiritual experience is visionary. It's transcendental. It's numinous. It's not a problem to be solved. It's paradoxical. The mind can't really contain it. And my mind would try, and I would try and rip these things to shreds. And then, so I would do it, go through this whole eviscerating of the experience and trying to reduce it, which is what the scientific worldview does. We try to reduce things to our parts to understand how they work. And I would talk myself almost into the fact that it couldn't have happened. And then the last realization was, but it did. And I really started to get that whole, I could skip all of that. It's good to understand to the best of our knowledge, sure. But beyond that, it's like with love. If you can't have a relationship with someone, if you're analyzing every little thing and reducing every little thing that happens to, a concept or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it reminds me of something we talked about earlier in this conversation when we were talking about journaling and how it can be a helpful tool for acknowledging our experience before we decide what to do with it. And so you had talked about how, like, the intellect can, try to decipher and even ultimately dismiss experience that doesn't neatly fit into what the intellect can grasp. And so that made me think of, the importance of acknowledging your experience and that little detail, but I experienced it, but it happened. And not ignoring that. I think it's so easy to push things away that we can't make sense of.
And two things that Andrew Harvey said to me that helped me enormously with this. The first was that the mind can't know what's beyond the mind, which was a radical idea. You mean there's something beyond the human mind? And the second was turn the dogs of doubt on doubt itself. So let the doubt be there, but doubt your doubt. Don't let doubt be the last word, because if it is, then you end up with nothing.
Yeah. Wow. There's so many directions that I'm inclined to go in. So let me, if I could, just read a short passage from Sex, Death, Enlightenment, because I think it's relevant to what we've been talking about. And also, you were in part motivated by your unhappiness, right? To kind of figure things out and explore. So I'll read the passage from the book. Happiness is the foundation of spiritual life, Mother Meera had said in her biography. Happiness, not striving, grasping, searching, suffering after an ideal. It bothered me that so much of the language of so many spiritual teachings was violent, referring to the annihilation of the ego, the dismemberment of vices, the death of the worldly self. It offended me, too, that these various prerequisites to awakening were said to be attained through the renunciation of the senses, which made the path to God seem barren, self-punishing, and no damn fun. The thought of spending the rest of my life opposing my natural impulses made my heart sink, while a path of joy inspired me and lifted my spirits. There's a lot there. And I think that, we associate a lot of our religion, the religion of our upbringing, with like rules and condemnation and, disapproval and punishment, right? As opposed to joy, right? Happiness. So can you speak a little bit to what it was like, even just to hear that passage being read to you, or what you would say to this now? Because you wrote this a while ago, right? This was from 1996 that this was published.
I don't disagree with anything that in that passage, and if anything, it's my life and experience have confirmed it, as well as speaking to a lot of fantastic, very realized masters over the years. They all come to the same point, which is that happiness is the purpose of spiritual life. The reason that we're doing this is to free ourselves of the false sense of self, to be, in order to experience the expansiveness, the lack of suffering, the compassion, the connection that comes from awakening. The Buddha early in his path had a similar realization after he had spent many, many years as an ascetic, and he was nearly dead from starving himself with self-mortification and punishing his flesh and looking for purity through suffering. He realized one day that he remembered a childhood memory of joy. And a woman came by, as the myth goes, and brought him some sweet rice, and he had been fasting, and he ate this sweet rice, and he remembered how delicious life could be. And that became integral to his philosophy. A lot of people misunderstand Buddhism as really being around focus on suffering. It's not. It's focused on happiness. But we have to, in order to be happy, we
How
have
to
to move
alleviate
through our
suffering.
suffering.
Yeah.
We have to understand it's there and its causes, or we're not going to be able to. But it's about healing from suffering. So this is a big thing, and it also comes down from the other side on with the Judeo-Christian tradition of original sin and coming in need of redemption and being these fleshly fallen creatures. So our whole lives become about pulling ourselves up as if we were ever fallen. It's ridiculous, and that never made sense to me at all. And no kind of religion that with a punishing and an angry or a judgmental God had any appeal to me. Well,
Right.
because we are obviously children of this creation. And we have good, we have bad, we have dark, we have shadows and light, but we are essentially of the earth. And is the earth bad because there are volcanoes? No, there are volcanoes, there are earthquakes, and the earth is sacred. And so it goes with us.
Yeah, the irony is that, throughout the ages, religion has been a means of controlling people. So it makes sense to instill fear if you want to control people. But what is kind of ironic and interesting to me is that if you look at the essence of spiritual teachings from a variety of traditions and what they have to say about, living the good life, if you abide by them, you're much likelier to be happy. You know what I mean? So in a way, it is the path of joy. It just gets maybe mangled in other agendas. But the teachings in their purest sense about loving each other, for instance, about having a code of ethics in the way that you treat others and yourself, right? This is what's going to bring you joy and happiness. This is what it means to live a good life. So it's but it can be, and I similarly have have been turned off by a lot of the sort of like traditional ways in which religion is presented to us, but I've always been curious too, and I've always, even though I've rejected religion after religion and ism after ism, there have always been these nuggets within each, and I say that's beautiful, that's absolutely beautiful, and something rings true about it. So kind of like parsing out what is actually helpful and of value, I think can be tricky, especially depending on our upbringings and the associations that we have with different teachings or religions.
A book that helped me a lot was Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy, because I realized that there is a mystic core, there's a universal perennial philosophy at the heart of all the world's traditions. It's the same one. That is the essential universal teaching around wisdom, liberation, and joy. And when I realized that what religion is this man-made buildup, this sort of exoskeleton that covers the heart of this, I became very interested in what is that heart. And the heart of all of them is non-dualism, non-duality, and the realization that all things are one, and that everything else is just a story, a mythology. I was never, ever interested in the mythology of things. I know people love mythology, they love fables, and they love legends, and that I have zero interest. I'm kind of boring that way. It's like, give it to me straight. And when I found non-duality as a path which runs through all of the religions, it finally something made complete sense to me. It didn't require special terminology, didn't require tradition. It was just required reason and experience and heart. And that to me is that's what I'm looking for in a spiritual path.
So interesting, because I know that as a kid, I loved the stories, whatever I believed or didn't believe or thought was ridiculous or not, like stories held great appeal. And your work in the world centers around stories and also in sort of discernment of truth. So this is really rich territory, I think. And I'm trying to decide how to pivot here. So essentially, on this podcast, I'm interested in people's journeys through life and in the person they want to be and in how this changes over the course of their lives. So you obviously had this profound experience you met Andrew Harvey, and it changed your life. But there was a buildup to that as well. You were deeply unhappy. You had experienced more loss that was added to the grief you probably hadn't even dealt with from your childhood. More grief to compound that, and you wanted serenity. You wanted like some peace. And I know that, having read Sex, Death, Enlightenment, I know that Mother Meera was a particularly pivotal figure as well. And you ended up writing a book about her. So what could you speak to the experience that you had, let's say, when you first met Mother Meera, and what came of that?
Meeting Mother Meera changed me because I saw in the flesh what a being, a person in another state of consciousness looked like. I had never seen that before in my life. I had only ever known ordinary consciousness and folks like me and various levels. It was the first time I saw someone doing something that was extraordinary. I couldn't understand it. It was having direct physical effects on me and on many, many other people. It was entirely simple, but it was beyond words. Because one of the things about Mother Meera is that her darshan, her blessing, is done without words. There's no teaching per se. She brings an energy to the meeting that is completely undeniable and really ineffable and inexplicable. So when I met her in Germany on the way to India, Andrew told me he wanted to introduce me to a friend of his. He didn't even tell me who it was, so it was perfect because I didn't have any preconceptions. But we walked into her little house in a village outside of Frankfurt. I didn't know anything, and I was struck by this silence in this place. I felt like my ears were like pulsating, and I looked at Andrew and he just nodded at me. So it was like it wasn't just my imagination. And then I went up the stairs and I peeked over, and the room was full. There were about 15 people in those days. And she was this tiny little Indian woman sitting on a chair. There was someone kneeling in front of her, and she was leaning forward with her hands on the side of their head. And I was completely sort of amazed. What was she doing? And then the person would go back and they would look into her eyes. The whole thing took maybe a minute. But it was so extraordinary. And I shut my eyes, Eric, after looking at her for a minute or two. I shut my eyes and I went into another state. I started to have visions. That night I slept for 15 hours. She was in all of my dreams. She was ripping me apart. I woke up bawling my eyes out, like something happened. Something I completely unplanned on my part. And I really feel like a lot of my healing started then, because a lot of my own grief was around my mother. It was around abandonment and all that, kind of stuff. And I had deep work to do, and it was as if something energetically had gone right there. And it started, and that's how I feel like my spiritual experiences really began then. And then I've had a few since that I absolutely could not explain, that were actually more, I won't go into them, but they were more unusual than that. I couldn't explain them, and that's very exciting. As a very hard-headed, rational person, it's very exciting to come up against stuff that you cannot explain. It happened. It's that impossible coincidence, quote unquote, that happens. Or what, the things that would happen with me and when I was living in Mother Meera's house for several months, things like that would happen. And so I realized again that I had a very small body of knowledge about what was really possible in this universe and what's really going on. And when you meet these people who are and Mother Meera is one of many. When you meet these people who are along the spectrum of awakening, they're just many notches beyond me. It's undeniable that they're in a different state. And of course, you go to India and they have an entire language for this. It's called Sukha, S-U-K-K-H-A, is that quality that enlightened beings exude. And it's very well known. It's been deeply studied for thousands of years. For us, it's like, whoa, what a revelation.
Right. Why do you think it's such an anomalous experience for people in the West?
Because we are materialistic. Our religion is scientific materialism. We are skeptical. We are all about ambition and getting ahead and consumerism, capitalism, and all of those things are anti-spiritual. They're direct opposite of what we need to discover ourselves, which is simplicity, introspection, lack of greed, humility, openness. Those are not the bywords of, capitalist America.
Right. So you write and publish Sex, Death, Enlightenment, and it's a bestseller. I mean, you like first book right out the gates, pretty successful. What was that experience like for you? How difficult or not was it to write? And what did you make of the reception of it?
I had been trying to write it for many years. And then in one of those cosmic jokes, somebody called me who said that, who I didn't know, left me a message on my machine saying, this is X. I've just come from Mother Meera's house in Germany, and I have something for you. Would you like to, she'd like you to have, would you come pick it up? I went to see her the next day. It turned out that she was the executive editor of Ballantine Books. She asked me what I was up to. I told her. She said, that absolutely sounds like a real book. Keep on going. And she was actually between jobs at the time. She said, if I'm ever in publishing again, I'm going to buy that book. It was just what I needed to hear in that moment. So I got back to work on it, and she started a new imprint, and it was the first book that she bought. And so for me, it was a dream come true. Suddenly I, who couldn't pay my rent, had gotten a major publisher to buy my memoir. So it was extraordinary. So that was the good news. The other news is that I then had to actually write the manuscript. And so what I did is I rented a room in the basement in the Village near where I lived in New York City. And I went there every day for a year, and it looked like a crazy person. It looked like an asylum. There were papers all over and pinned to the walls. And I just wrote it. And also at that time, I thought, who knows how long I'm going to be here? This is probably my last book. This is my only chance I'm ever going to have to say anything meaningful. So there was a lot of pressure. So I wrote, in a year, I wrote 700 pages, which is kind of crazy. And it ended up being whittled down to 300. But that's what it was like. It was exhilarating and really, really scary. And I just wanted to live to see it through. And it was just a crazy time. I was a kind of time out of time. Everything else went to the wayside. And I also learned how to write. I mean, on the one hand, I was writing that particular book, but on the other hand, I'd never written a book before. So I needed to figure out, how do you put together a book? It's both the most difficult and the most exhilarating thing if you've ever done it. It's an incredible experience, but it's hard, like labor. And that was my first experience of labor.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That really helps, kind of give me a sense of what that was, because all we ever experience typically as consumers are finished products, right? Things just appear, and as if like immaculate conception. But anyone that's worked on anything knows that is not usually. I mean, maybe there are some flukish exceptions, but there is a lot of labor involved in delivering a creative work such as a book, let alone a memoir. And in your memoir, I mean, you are so extremely candid and raw in telling your story. It comes across as fearlessness to the reader. It's like, wow, this guy literally he's fearless to share the way that you do. And it's also so compelling to read. It's very intense. It's filled with the drama of human life, just the extreme emotions and experiences, but shared so personally. It's I don't think I've read a book quite like it. I mean, so it's not like, I mean, so many books we're considering, oh, what's this person going to think, or how's this going to sell, or how's this going to be perceived, or how am I like it's none of that. It's just like, here's my story, from the heart, direct, as honest as I can tell it.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate that. That was my intention. My intention was, if this could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. If I could have a spiritual awakening, whatever you want to call it, an opening to it could happen to absolutely anyone, because like I said, I'm a very skeptical, doubting person.
Right.
I am doubting Thomas. That's my nature. And so that's what I wanted to communicate. And the
Huh.
fact that it did communicate to people surprised me and was a thrill. And then also I got to travel around the world, and I had a very charmed
Hmm.
entry into the publishing business. In those days, they used to send you on big book tours, and it was a wonderful experience for me.
I'm curious. So if that call had never come, it sounds like you had already started working on the book. And then this call came really validating, like, oh, this is the right path, and someone actually cares, and there's interest and all of that, right? Because we often don't have that experience. What would you say to writers, and I know you've worked with many of them, who struggle to discern whether, like, let's call it the purity of a call that they have to write something. And let's say their experience is utter disinterest from the world. Anytime they write something, attempt to share it, put it out, attempt to, get the interest of an agent or a publisher. What do you make of that? And how would you interpret that as a sign one way or another to proceed or to shift gears with what you're doing?
It depends what you're talking. If you're talking about publishing a book, the options for how to do that have multiplied since
Mm,
I started in publishing in the 90s. Now you can, self-publishing or hybrid publishing. There's so many ways of doing it. So it's no longer really an excuse to say, well, nobody would buy my book, because you're put up against the challenge. If it really matters to you, you will
you can
do
do
it,
it. Right.
and you will do it anyway.
Right.
And so that that is something that writers really have a lot more options, which make it harder in certain ways and make it easier in other ways. The other part of the question is about feeling consistently nobody cares, because there are so many channels of communicating, not only writing but opinion. If you're putting your opinion out there in some way on some platform, whatever it happens to be, and you're getting nothing back, then chances are you're not connecting, and that's something to think about. But we don't have any excuses now. The editors are no longer the
Gatekeepers.
gatekeepers.
Right.
They're not. You can put a piece on Thrive Global or any of these platforms as a freelancer, and have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have access to it. And so, but you do, of course, have to be saying something interesting, and
Right.
you need to be doing it in a fairly interesting way, because not everyone should write.
Hmm.
That's the other thing. The
Or
idea that
share it, right?
everyone,
Or not everyone should write in a public way, or
that's what I
yeah.
mean is, what I mean is not everyone should write in a public way. And there's this assumption now that we should, because we can.
Mm,
But if it's not impacting, if it's not landing, then there's generally, a reason for that too.
right. I know that we're running out of time, but I want to read a passage from another one of your books and use it to uh, open up a dialogue about basically becoming the person you want to be, which is what this show is all about. And in fact, you even use those words almost exactly in the passage, which was kind of striking. So this is from the introduction of your book, When You're Falling, Dive. Here we go. You write, while hardship can certainly render us bitter, selfish, defensive, and miserable, it can also be used quite differently as the artery of interconnection, a bridge to other people in pain, as blood in the muscle that propels us. Crisis takes us to the brink of our limits and forces us to keep moving forward. When people in extremis call it a blessing, this is the paradox they are describing. This paradox is hard to swallow. When I used to tell friends half jokingly that HIV had actually saved my life, they rarely understood what I meant. I wasn't promoting an awful virus or claiming I was glad to have it. I wasn't pretending to be overjoyed by the prospect of an early departure. I was simply confessing an odd bit of truth that I wouldn't have believed myself had my own life not improved so dramatically. Without the threat of mortal loss, I would never have had the conviction, the fuel to become the person I wanted to be, or to find my way through terrible dread to something stronger than fear. Wow. Wow. So my first question after reading that is what is stronger than fear?
Presence,
Hmm.
understanding and wisdom and presence are stronger than fear. Self-awareness, when we get to come to know what we actually are, is much, much stronger than fear. And for me, it was tapping into the spirituals, tapping into something larger than myself. It was much, much, much bigger than my fear. When you realize that your fear of mortality, for example, is a universal phenomenon, it stops being such a personal thing. And when you practice self-inquiry, which is my primary, interest, you start to say, what is this fear? Who is afraid? What is that thing afraid of? You start to look at it closer, you realize that it's an illusion. And that's the great beauty of it. So I have become somebody, I'm not fear-free. By the way, fearlessness isn't the lack of fear. It's
Doing in
being
spite
big
of fear.
enough for fear to be there and not be stopped by it.
Yeah.
That's my definition of fearlessness. So I am not fearless, but I'm a lot less fearful than I used to be. And I'm not as afraid of what people think. And I'm not trying to kind of measure myself by external standards, which is also a beauty of getting older. I just turned 65. And one of the great things about getting older is things that mattered in the past just don't matter. You don't have the time, you don't have the energy, frankly, you don't have the interest. And life gets much simpler and it gets a lot better. So what I would say to people is, as you get older, really take the spiritual path seriously, because you need it more and more and more as the older you get. And it also, by the way, brings joy. It brings self-awareness, and it brings the ability to connect to people without so much interference, without so much ego defensiveness and projection and protectiveness. So that's my rally call for spiritual seeking, because it really did change my experience of being alive.
Wow, that is beautifully put. And it's also very heartening to hear for any of us and all of us that are actually aging, myself included. So to wrap this up, I would just love, I know that you shared just before we started talking, or just before we started the interview, that you have a new book that you have completed. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about that, as well as, what is alive for you at the moment in terms of the person you aspire to be at this point, and looking ahead.
Sure. Well, I've been writing a book about Ralph Waldo Emerson for the last 3 years. My love affair with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who has saved my life many, many times over the years, and particularly how Stoicism is present in Emerson, the Stoic philosophy, which is different from people's idea of what Stoic. People think Stoic means, swallow your emotion. No, ancient Stoicism is a very beautiful spiritual path, and Ralph Waldo Emerson was very much a modern Stoic. And so I've spent 3 years writing this book. I finished it this very day. I turned it in, and
Today?
Today.
Oh, congratulations!
I turned
Wow.
it in this morning, and it'll be out next April. And I'm excited about it. It's the first time I've written about something that was quite so mainstream. So I'll be interested to, see what happens.
What's the title of the book?
It's called Lessons from an American Stoic: How Emerson Can Change Your Life.
Great.
So that will be out next April. And as far as where I am in terms of becoming the person I want to be, or what interests me, I've never been so happy. And that is with all of the crisis in the world, and I certainly have issues in my own life, and people I know are having problems, but I've really come to a place where I feel like I'm not fighting with my own reality, and so good, the bad, some days better than others, but there's this underlying gratitude for being here that changes everything. And I really have learned, because I had a lot of self-pity. Gratitude is the antidote to self-pity. You can't feel grateful, even for the smallest thing, and self-pitiful at the same time. So try that and see if I have never managed to do it. So gratitude really has changed a lot of my life. I'm grateful, and I'm concerned for the world and the horrors of what's going on in the world. And it's not the end of the story.
Wow. Yeah. I like how there's room for both.
Both are true.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. And that's a big part of the Emerson book, because he was also always saying that paradox is everything. Everything has two sides to it. Everything. That's not a problem. The problem is we think in a linear way that things should just have one side, one outcome, one thing that's right and one thing that's wrong. It's not so. In the East, they think dialectically. It's both and. Yin and yang both exist. One doesn't negate the other. And the same goes with our lives. So whatever is happening in our lives is painful and suffering. It's real. Feel it, be with it, but know that it's not the end of the story. It's not the ultimate reality, because you will wake up. It will be different tomorrow or the next day. And you will look back at that feeling almost as if it was a dream. And then you ask yourself, what was real? And that is the question I think we all need to be asking ourselves.
Wow. There was a great quote that Jack Kornfield shared. I heard him share, and I think it was from a poem he was reading, and I don't have it at my fingertips at the moment, but it was very similar along the lines of what you just said, which is something to the effect of, people ask, how can you be happy or joyful when so much suffering is going on around you, and when there's so much horror going on in the world? And there was an answer to this question that was very much along the lines of what you were talking about the both and it said that basically to pay attention only to the suffering and the pain is to basically support the devil. That was more, I'm paraphrasing, but like, in other words, being joyful is, it doesn't ignore the pain and the suffering, but it's sort of like a counter, and it's sort of like, and this, yes, there's all of this horror, and there's this, this can be too. So, Mark Matousek, thank you so much. This has been an awesome conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks, Eric.
I really appreciate your time. And I'd like to point people in the direction of your work. So I will share this in the show notes. Your website is your name, markmatousek.com. And you also run this online community called the Seekers Forum. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. theseekersforum.com. It's a really terrific group of people. I give a weekly guided writing session. I give a monthly broadcast and a guest interview. It's people from all over the world, from all different walks of life. I wanted a place where people who were interested in dialogue more than dogma, and a place where you could, how do you live a spiritual life in the real world? That's really what I'm interested in. And that's what this community is all about. So people would love to, if people would like to join us, it would be great to have you there.
Yeah, and I happened to, just by poking around on the website, see that your career as an interviewer continues to this day, except instead of interviewing like pop culture icons, you're interviewing, like the deepest thinkers, and in such an array of fields. It's really impressive when I was looking at some of the interviews that you've conducted yourself. So I'm sure there's incredible material within. And again, I thank you so much. I wish you the best with your book, your forthcoming book. It's very exciting. And just thank you for all the work that you do and for being a light in the world.
Thank you, Eric. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.